Exodus, and we're going to be at chapter 23. Exodus chapter 23. And we're going to talk this morning about what real justice looks like. What real justice looks like. We're certainly living in a time where justice is the word of the day, right? And whether it be tagged with, social justice or those kind of things, there's much use of that word, and yet it seems like everyone often has a different opinion of what that actually looks like in practice, right? Exodus chapter 23, we're going to cover verses 1 through 9 because this gives us good instruction on how we deal with each other and what real dealings with each other should look like. Okay? Now, Exodus chapter 23 is in a part of the scripture that are called the judgments. In Exodus chapter 21, verse 1, it said, "Now these are the judgments." It's been pointed out before that when you read through the Exodus or you read through the Old Testament law, there's three different ways that you potentially look at that, right? There's God's moral law, there's Israel's civil law, and then there is the ceremonial law. The moral law, of course, are those things that, are eternally right and wrong. Those are the foundational reflections of God's character. Those are kind of reflected in what we might call the Ten Commandments and some other commandments in the Old Testament. Exodus 21 through 23 deal with more of what they call the judgments, or what we would call Israel's civil law, right? There were some things that applied to Israel as a nation. We have a founding document, right? We have what's called the Constitution. That's the document that details the laws for our country, and all laws would be subject to that. Israel had the same thing. Of course, the Ten Commandments were God's moral law, and yet in this stretch, you are actually dealing with laws that governed them as a nation. These were the laws of Israel. These weren't the 10 written in stone, but these were the laws that founded them as a nation, as a people. This was how they were to interact and to deal with each other. Of course, we won't be talking much tonight or today about the ceremonial law, but those are things that in the orders and sacrifices certainly were fulfilled in Christ and aren't applicable as well anymore. But in Exodus 23, let's read verse 1 through 9. This is what real justice looks like. Verse 1, "Thou shalt not raise a false report. Put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. Neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. If thou meet thine enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him. If thou see the ass of him that hateth thee lying under his burden, and wouldest forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help with him. Thou shalt not wrest the judgment of the poor in his cause. Keep thee far from a false matter, and the innocent and the righteous slay thou not, for I will not justify the wicked. And thou shalt take no gift, for the gift blindeth the wise and perverteth the words of the righteous. Also thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt." This particular passage deals with judicial matters and how they were to be handled. I think there's important things here that we can draw out. I want to divide these up three ways as we kind of go through these in verse order. Number one, let's look at these things regarding honesty and truthfulness. Okay? Point number one, regarding honesty and truthfulness. In verse 1 and 2, we have the necessary foundation and ruling principles for any matter. What is it? It's this. It's that truth should always be the objective, right? Truth is important. When a court convenes, when a judicial matter is attempting to be decided, the preeminent goal is that the truth be established, right? We want to know what happened. In verse number 1, the first part, it says, thou shalt not raise a false report. Don't lie. Now that seems almost kind of backwards, right? It seems almost so simplistic to think that that should be the first foundational principle that rules our interactions with each other, or our justice toward each other, is that we don't lie. But I think we all know and can see that sometimes justice is not always meted out because people do lie. The Bible puts a premium on honesty and on truthfulness. Let's look here at a scripture in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 19. Deuteronomy chapter 19. As I read these, the verses will fall back in. You'll become familiar with them. If you've heard them before, it'll be brought back to your mind. Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. Deuteronomy 19, verse 15, it says, one witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity, or for any sin, in any sin that he sinneth. Now, but at the mouth of two witnesses, or at the mouth of three witnesses, shall the matter be established. If a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him that which is wrong, then both the men, both whom the controversy is, shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges, which shall be in those days. And the judges shall make diligent inquisition. And behold, if the witness be a false witness, and have testified falsely against his brother, then ye shall do unto him as he thought to have done unto his brother. And so shalt thou put away the evil from among you. I think we're familiar with the Old Testament concept, and it's actually reiterated later on even in the New, this concept of in the mouth of two or three witnesses having something be established, right? The concept of trying to avoid he said, she said, right? Your word against mine. Because the Bible puts such a premium on truth. You know, obviously, I got two sons. They share a room. You can imagine they never have disagreements. They never have fights, right? Let's imagine the scenario where Josiah and Elliot, they share a room, and something of Josiah's comes up missing. And he comes to me and says, you know, Dad, hey, my basketball is missing. Elliot must have taken it, right? Now, he didn't see Elliot take it. He doesn't really have any knowledge to that fact. He doesn't have any evidence to that fact. It's just, I think Elliot took it. Elliot must have taken it. Okay, let's go ask Elliot. Elliot, did you take Joe's basketball? No, I didn't take Joe's basketball. What do we do then? Right? Well, what do you do? Well, the Bible would put you in a kind of an awkward position, right? Now, what do you do? And that's the simplest scenario. But what do you do as that escalates, right? Where it really is one person's word against another person. The Bible really prescribes that kind of situation be approached with great caution. Because we don't want to impugn anyone's integrity, because we don't want to assume that anyone is lying. In fact, we want to believe and assume that everyone is being truthful. I want to assume that Josiah is being truthful. I want to assume that Elliot is being truthful. So Joe says, Elliot must have taken it. He says he didn't. I'm not sure that there's any grounds right then and there, if that is all that there is, to say, okay, well, Elliot, you're grounded for a month for stealing Joe's basketball. I don't actually know that he did. I don't have any evidence to the fact other than Josiah saying that, right? Now, why is honesty important? Because Josiah can strengthen his case if he says, I saw Elliot take my basketball. See, then it's different, isn't it? If he says, I saw Elliot take my basketball. But you have to be careful with that, right? Because if you didn't see him do it, you have just become a false witness. A false witness. And we don't want false witness. That's the very first dealing. That's the very first foundational point there in Exodus 23 about our dealings with each other, is that we shall not raise a false report. We have to deal with each other truthfully. Okay? We need to be able, if we are going to, and this would have governed, again, Israel's foundation as a society, as a nation. If you're going to have any kind of real relationship and basic good in society, that has to be built on the foundation of trust and being able to assume that we can trust each other because we're not going to lie to each other. Don't raise a false report. Now, the second foundational principle with regard to truthfulness and honesty is followed up with that in verse 2. Exodus 23, verse 2. Exodus 23, verse 2. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. Again, the second point is just as important, right? Because this is, again, truth is the objective. If truth is what's important, and truth is important so that verse number 1 will say, truth is so important, I'm going to command no lies. Don't raise a false report, no lying. Truth is actually so important that it actually outweighs public opinion. It actually outweighs a majority opinion. Truth is more important than that, right? Don't follow a multitude to do evil. We are encouraged to be men and women of honor and integrity, honesty, and doing right, even if we would have to do it alone. The Bible would want that. God wanted that for Israel. He wanted them to do right and to deal honestly, even if they had to do it alone. And if the multitude has gone in a way that is going to wrest or to twist judgment, he says, you don't do that. Don't follow the public opinion. Don't follow the majority opinion. That's difficult, right? But for real justice, for real right and righteousness to be done, it has to be that way. I think about the difficulty that some have. Now you guys know that I like football. I like sports, but I really like football. And I think about how difficult it would be, right, to be like an official or a referee at a football game. And here you are, you're in the middle of 50,000 fans, and you know that as soon as you make the call, you're getting ready to get booed by 50,000 people, right? So what should a referee do? Should he not make the call because it's going to make 50,000 people unhappy? Or should he do what's right? No, the game has rules. This is the call that has to be made. What should he do? Well, he should do what's right, shouldn't he? It's not going to be popular. It's not going to be the majority opinion. It's certainly not going to follow public opinion, but he's supposed to do what's right, and he's supposed to do what's right all the time. You have to be really careful about making public opinion the authority, right? Truth has to be objective. If you were to try to make public opinion the authority, here's where you're going to struggle with that. Just take a look at society. Take a look at how often public opinion changes, right? Things that people think one day, they may not think the next. The waves of society, right? They up and down, and things that are okay one day won't be okay one day, and things that aren't okay one day will be okay one day. And public opinion, man, it's like waves of the ocean, right? I mean, it's just up and down and back and forth all the time. That's why truth has to be the objective. We do not set out in our dealings with each other to intentionally try to tick the majority off, right? Neither are we going to assume that the majority is always right or that the majority is always wrong. Real justice deals with you doing what's right regardless of what the majority is doing, right? Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. That doesn't mean it won't be easy, because if the multitude is doing it, it's the road that's easily worn, right? It's the easiest path. It's the path of least resistance, we might say. But the Lord would say, no, in regards to truthfulness and honesty, truth has to be the objective. And that means you can't lie, and that means that you also have the fortitude to do what's right, even if more people than not aren't. Okay? Truth has to be the objective. And if the majority of people think something is right or wrong, you try to still look at it through the eyes of truth. Okay? You try to discern what's right. instead of just, well, what's everyone else doing? Okay, that's important foundation. All right, now let me get to the second point, because beginning with verse 3, we're going to see point number 2, those things regarding partiality and favoritism. Now, partiality and favoritism can greatly hinder real justice, real doing right with each other. Let's look at this in verse number 3. Neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. Now that verse gets to the heart of partiality, right? Because let's use the example of today. Sometimes today, especially, maybe in our country, it's easy to vilify people, right? We just vilify groups of people. One group, it's easy to vilify are people that have money, right? The rich. Eat the rich. Do whatever you want to the rich. It's the rich's fault we're in the shape that we're in. Or it's kind of assumed that if somebody has anything, if somebody has wealth, if somebody has money, well, they only have that because they just stepped on everybody all the way along to get that. You have to be careful with that kind of mindset, right? Turn to the book of just over Leviticus, chapter 19. Just over one book from where you are. You have to be able, if you want real justice to be done, you have to be able to look past the circumstances that are on the surface and really look to the heart of the matter. In Leviticus chapter 19, read verse 15. Okay? Because it's going to cover both sides. Leviticus 19, verse 15. Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. Thou shalt not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. But in righteousness shalt thou judge thy neighbor. In other words, don't make the assumption, or don't begin the conversation looking at the idea, well, this person's poor, so, and let that influence what would maybe be right. Or, well, this person's rich, so we're going to automatically assume, like, let's take the rich and the poor, right? We're going to assume that this one's innocent until proven guilty, but because this person's rich, we're going to assume guilt and make him prove innocence. Or vice versa. This person's poor, we're going to look at them kind of shady, so we're going to assume they're guilty until they prove otherwise, and the rich will assume he's innocent. We don't want to do that, right? We don't want those, superficial outlying items to cloud judgment, to cloud the way that we would try to uncover what's true and what's right. He says in verse 15 again, ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. Your objective is to do right. Isn't that what it says? You don't get to do any unrighteousness in judgment. You're supposed to do what's right. So he puts two in front of you, the poor and the mighty. Okay, don't do wrong, right? He puts the poor, he puts the mighty, but what does he say it again at the end of the verse? But in righteousness shalt thou judge thy neighbor. Those two things aren't to be indicators or aren't to be factors in you doing right. Right? So these verses get at the heart of partiality or favoritism, and the attempt that we should be making to look beyond circumstances and look to the heart of the matter. I don't know if you've ever been on jury duty. I sat on a jury, it's been better than 10 years ago, but for a trial there in Troy for someone who had been accused of assault. And when you go for jury selection, and this one was actually going to trial, it was going to be a 2.5-day trial, they were asking questions of all the potential jurors. And what they were doing in some of those questions were trying to figure out who had potential, favoritism or partiality in these things. This was a fight that happened outside of a bar. One of the questions that they asked to the jury pool, to all the people that were there, like, well, how do you feel about drinking? Do you feel that people that went to the bar, that they were just asking for trouble and whatever happens there, happens there? They asked questions about, how do you feel about police? How do you feel about, should this kind of scenario be, covered by the police? Should these kind of people be arrested? What they're trying to do is they're trying to find out who feels certain ways on certain subjects, because they're going to say, now listen, I don't want that person. That person has, they're too emotionally invested in this to make an objective call. They feel like this. They feel like this. Somebody who makes a judge or someone to sit on a jury panel, if you're overly emotional, you're probably not very good at that, and wouldn't make a good judge, or wouldn't make a good person on a jury, right? Too easily swayed by emotion and not by truth, and not by righteousness, or not by fact. You don't want somebody sitting in a jury box that thinks, there's not really enough evidence, but look at him. I think he did it, right? No, you don't want that. That's absolutely wrong. You want people that can be objective with truth and try to do right according to facts and to evidence and what is true. We just can't live that way. You just can't rule that way. Let's go back to our text in Exodus 23. So this stretch of these verses deals with the heart of partiality and favoritism, and being able to do right by people regardless of circumstance, regardless of other factors like that. So he said in verse 3, neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. Yes, there is a degree of sympathy, of course, that you should have for people in their circumstances. But it can't twist judgment. It can't change, doing right by people. You have to be able to do right by people all the time. Let's look at verse 4. Verse 4 and 5 deal with us telling us to treat people right, even if you don't like them. Verse number 4, Exodus 23, verse 4. If thou meet thine enemy's ox, or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again. If thou see the ass of him that hateth thee, lying under his burden, and wouldest forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help with him. Matthew 7, verse 12 always applies, right? The golden rule. As thou wouldest that men should do unto you, do it unto them. When he notes here, he mentions twice your enemy or him that hateth you. He uses two different ways of explaining that. But verse 4 and 5 teach us to treat people right regardless of how they have treated you, or regardless of how they would treat you. And verse number 4, if thou meet thine enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again. Now, it doesn't tell you to do that for a friend, does it? Why? Well, duh. If I had a family member or a friend and I saw their ox or their ass going astray, I'd be just like, I'd make phone call. Hey, your ox is out of the pen, bud. What do we got to do? Let's get it back. Let's do that. But what happens if you see your enemy's ass or ox going astray? You look out the window and just keep sipping the coffee and think, yep, well, that jerk just lost a lot of money. He deserves it. You know what? I don't really have anything to do this morning, but I'm certainly not going to help that guy. Do you know how he treated me? You know the things he says about me? If he thinks I'm going to go out there and help him, no chance. The Bible says, don't do that. If you see your enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it. Come on, do the right thing. But he's my enemy. Do the right thing anyway. Doing what's right is more about you and your own character, not about what people deserve. It's not about looking at someone and trying to make a decision, well, do they deserve for me to do them right? You're supposed to do them right because of who you are. You're supposed to do what's right all the time. If thou see thy enemy's ox or ass going astray, help. It's interesting in Matthew chapter 5, and I'm going to quote it to make sure I don't quote it wrong, because we struggle with this one, right? In Matthew chapter 5, verse 43, ye have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Jesus said to love your enemies. Now I always have to clarify this, right? Jesus did not say to try to love your enemies. Because I think sometimes that's what we get out of that verse, right? Love, a preacher will preach this, and that we ought to love our enemies, and I'm really trying. It doesn't say to try. It says love your enemies. I'm doing the best that I can. Well, it doesn't tell you to make an attempt at it. It doesn't tell you to take a stab at it, shoot for it, do the best you can. No, it says love your enemies. You're supposed to do right to everyone, right? Where Jesus is supposed to be our model. In 1 Peter, where it talks about Jesus, when he was reviled, he reviled not again. When he was, when he was smitten, he didn't return that. And we're told to not return, railing for railing. We've covered recently. We're supposed to do right. You say, but that guy's my enemy. Come on. If it was your ox, if it was your, if it was your belongings that had gotten away and gotten loose, and you were staring at a desperate situation, you would want help. Do people right. So he covers it two different ways. Thine enemy, or if you see the ass of him that hateth thee lying under his burden, and wouldest forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help him. Do what's right. The Lord was encountered with this in his ministry when Jesus helped someone in Luke chapter 14. Turn there real quick. Luke chapter 14. Luke 14 verse 1, it says, it came to pass as he went into the house on one of the chief Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath day, and they watched him. Behold, there was a certain man before him which had the dropsy. And Jesus answering spake unto the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? And they held their peace. And he took him and healed him and let him go. And answered them, saying, which of you shall have an ass or an ox fallen into a pit, and will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him again to these things. You all know the story, and it's not just here, it's multiple times throughout the New Testament. Jesus could do something good for someone. Jesus might heal someone. And the first response from one portion of the crowd is, you shouldn't have done that. It's the Sabbath day. Jesus uses in this passage, don't you think it's right to do right by people? If you had an ox, or what does Jesus say? If you had an ass or an ox and it had fallen into a pit, would you honestly look at it and say, oh, help you out. We'd get your ox out of the ditch, but can't. It's the Sabbath day. No, if it was your ox, you'd get down there, you'd get in the mud, you'd get in the dirt, you'd get in there, and you would try to help get it out. It's right to do right by people. So if it's your enemy, or if it's him that hateth you, you know what Israel's law said? You do right. You do right. Don't let your eyes be colored by partiality or favoritism. If it's right to do to your friend, it's right to do to your enemy. If it's the right thing to do, let that be the governor of your decisions, right? Not their, their hatred for you or their stance as your enemy. Jesus would repeat that and say, love them. Don't try to love them. Love them. Love your enemies. Verse number 6. So this is our text. Exodus 23, verse 6. Thou shalt not wrest the judgment of thy poor in his cause. Don't twist judgment just because of someone's circumstance. Okay? In the book of James, we're warned there about people that see someone who's dressed well and comes in and looks the part and he looks nice and he's exalted and he's recognized and he's honored. And there's a caution that's attached to that, right? You don't want to honor, you don't want to give honor or dishonor unknowingly in the wrong. When something is brought before us, we have to make a commitment to try to do what's right and set aside those things that would glaze our eyes a certain way. Listen, I have favorite people in this world. There are people that I like more than anyone else, right? Like my family. I like them more than I like anybody else. It's just the way that it is. I love them. They're my family. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being partial to someone's circumstance, to someone's scenario, and allowing that to glaze whether or not you do right by them. And Israel's law was, don't do that. You do right. Don't let those other things cloud your vision and your judgment. Now, number 3, the third point in our text, let's cover verse 7 through 9, because the third set of thoughts here regarding character and integrity. Okay, so number 3, regarding character and integrity. Exodus 23, verse 7 says, keep thee far from a false matter. And the innocent and the righteous slay thou not, for I will not justify the wicked. Keep thee far from a false matter. One of the best things that you can do for yourself is to stay away from liars. Is to not keep company with people that are just dishonest. Yes, we're in this world. We want to make every attempt that we can to win people, to be a good influence on people. We do not want people who are dishonest to have an influence over us. We don't want them to have a majority opinion in our life. We don't want them to be our most trusted counselor. We don't want them to be people that we go to for wisdom. You want to be influenced by people that are honest, by people that care about the truth. He says to stay away or to keep thee far from a false matter. We don't want to. We want to stay away from liars and false matters. We don't want to be persuaded to rule on something contrary to how the Lord might rule. I realize that lying breeds lying, right? One lie leads to another. Liars breed liars. False confidence in pragmatism. You know, it's easy to be influenced because it does seem like sometimes the more that liars succeed, it becomes tempting to follow that. You got to break that, okay? You got to stay away from a false report. Don't allow the false report to influence you and those that would raise it. Regarding your character and your integrity, verse number 8 says, and thou shalt take no gift, for the gift blindeth the wise and perverteth the words of the righteous. What is that talking about? That's talking about bribery, right? Gifts pervert justice. I think we got to just be careful with that, right? Bribery perverts justice. I think there's already a feeling sometimes in our culture, maybe in our country, right, that if somebody has money, they can get away with everything, right? Because they'll just buy their way out, right? They'll pay off this or they'll do that. We don't want to continue those stereotypes, right? We want to make sure that when it comes to righteousness, when it comes to justice, that we don't allow ourselves to be influenced. He says, take no gift. The gift blindeth the wise. You have to do right by people. And if someone, in an attempt to sway your opinion or to sway your justice and righteous dealings, buddies up to you and, tries to sway you a certain way, you have to be careful with that, right? You don't want to be someone who could be accused of being bought. You don't want your righteousness to be for sale, right? You want to be known as the person that's always going to try to do what's right all the time. And that nothing, even money, even someone's gift or someone's promises is going to divert you from trying to do what's right and trying to do what's right all the time. So don't accept the gift. The gift blindeth the wise and perverteth the words of the righteous. I also think that verse number 9 is interesting, that it's lumped in here and it's put in this same context. But I do want to say that it's important. Verse number 9, and thou shalt not oppress a stranger. For ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. The Lord cautioned Israel how they might deal with foreigners and strangers. Now, I'll say this. True Christianity and people that want to do true, righteous justice, we should have very little patience with racism. We should have very little patience with the partiality and favoritism that deals with people nationally, ethnically, or according to the color of their skin. That perverts justice. And the Lord told them, you don't do wrong to someone just because they're a stranger. What's the reasoning he gives them? If anything, Israel knew what it was like to be a stranger, didn't they? Here you had Egypt for all those years where they were in slavery and where they were in bondage in Egypt. And if anyone could know and understand what it would feel like to be oppressed because they were different, because they were foreigners, Israel just left that. The Lord says you can't turn around and start doing that to other people. Just because they're a foreigner, just because they're a stranger, you don't get, that's not justification for you to oppress them. You have to do right by them too. These are not just laws that deal with how Israel treats each other. This is how Israel should treat outsiders. This is how they should treat the foreigners and the strangers. Listen, when I give these, when I talk about us doing right by each other, that's not just something that exists in these four walls. This is something that exists for us when we leave this place. That we're not going to be governed by theories like, partiality or favoritism or racism or ethnic things like that. Our goal is to do right. When we talk about justice, we're not talking about anything else that other people want to use to cloud what real justice is. What does real justice look like? Here's a great passage because it tells you, you do right. You make sure that truth is paramount. You make sure that the truth matters. If you're alone against a majority, you make sure that truth matters. Truth matters so much that you don't get to raise a false report. Doing right is so important that even if it's your enemy, you do right. Even if it's the stranger or the foreigner, you do them right. Your character should never be brought into question. You don't take bribes, you don't raise false reports, and you should stay far from a false matter. Christians should be known as people that deal in honor and integrity and righteousness. Truth should be most important to us. We want to see what is right done. Now, we may not get that all the time, right? Because we may not actually have the final say. And you and I live in a world where sometimes wrong wins the day. Sometimes the person that does wrong wins. Sometimes the person that did something wrong gets away with it. Those things happen. But you and I, in how we live and in how we deal with each other, should always try to do what's right. We should try to seek out what is true and right and let that be how we mingle with each other, how we live with each other. Okay, this is a great passage. If anybody wants to ask you, what do you think about justice? What's real justice look like? This is a very good starting point because it governs how we're supposed to deal with each other. All right, let's be dismissed. Father, we're thankful.